In the small, fog-swathed town of Elmdale, Facebook Marketplace was merely a convenient way to buy old furniture or trade knickknacks. That was until Tom Reynolds, a local college student, stumbled upon an ad that piqued his interest. Antique mirror, belonged to 18th century French aristocracy, slight imperfections, best offer. The grainy image showed a beautifully ornate mirror, its frame a labyrinth of golden swirls, hinting at a majestic past. Tom, an enthusiast of all things vintage, felt an irresistible pull. With a few messages exchanged, Tom was on his way to pick up the mirror from a seller named Marjorie, who lived on the outskirts of town. The winding roads, shrouded in mist, seemed to stretch endlessly. When Tom finally arrived, the house was an old Victorian relic, its facade peeling and windows boarded up partially, giving it a forlorn look. Marjorie, an elderly woman with a surprisingly brisk manner, met him at the door. "It's up in the attic. No one's used that thing in ages. Belonged to my great-aunt," Marjorie explained as they ascended the creaky stairs. The attic was stifling, cluttered with boxes and old furniture covered in dusty sheets. There, against the far wall, stood the mirror, somehow gleaming through the gloom. Tom handed over the cash without haggling, driven by an inexplicable urgency. He hauled the mirror into his car, the glass cool and smooth under his touch. As he drove back, the roads seemed quieter, the night darker, and the air denser. Tom shrugged off the unease creeping into his spine. Back at his apartment, Tom cleaned the mirror meticulously. That night, as the clock chimed 3, something odd occurred. Tom, restless, noticed a flicker of movement in the mirror. Thinking it was his imagination, he tried to sleep, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Reluctantly, he turned to face the mirror. In the dim light, he saw not his own reflection but the faint outline of a woman, her face twisted in sorrow. Tom blinked, and the vision was gone. The following days were marked by an escalation of eerie incidents. Objects moved on their own, whispers filled the room, and the mirror seemed to always be slightly warm to the touch. Tom began researching the mirror's history, tracing it back to a French aristocrat named Antoinette Roux, who was rumored to have been a practitioner of the dark arts and met a mysterious end. One evening, determined to uncover the truth, Tom sat before the mirror and spoke. "Antoinette, are you there?" The air chilled, and a voice, soft yet clear, responded, "Libre moi. Free me." Tom contacted a local paranormal expert, Dr. Helena Lutz, who agreed to help. Together, they delved deeper into the rituals Antoinette might have practiced, discovering a possible connection to a spirit trapped within the mirror, bound by a curse that only a specific ritual could break. The plan was set for a séance to communicate with Antoinette's spirit and attempt to free it. Dr. Lutz, Tom, and 2 of her colleagues gathered around the mirror, candles flickering as they recited chants from an ancient grimoire. The mirror's surface rippled like liquid, and the figure of Antoinette appeared, her eyes pleading. As they reached the climax of the ritual, a violent wind erupted in the room, extinguishing the candles and shrouding everything in darkness. The sound of shattering glass pierced the air, followed by an oppressive silence. When the lights returned, the mirror was intact, but the image was starkly clear, showing not the room but a dark, shadowy void. From this abyss, a voice whispered, "Too late," and a hand, pale and cold, reached out from the mirror's surface. Tom recoiled in horror as the figure of Antoinette stepped through, her eyes no longer pleading but burning with malice. "Freedom has a price," she hissed as she moved closer. As she approached, her intentions unclear but her presence threatening, Tom's heart pounded with the realization that the true nature of the curse was far darker and more complex than they had imagined. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and the faint outline of other figures began to appear in the corners of the room, each step of Antoinette's bringing them closer to a truth that threatened to engulf them all. Ents of dread. Tom, Dr. Lutz, and the others were frozen, unable to move or look away from the specter that had stepped into their reality. Antoinette's eyes, black as the void she had emerged from, scanned the room, her gaze piercing each of them like icy needles. Her lips curled into a sinister smile as she began to speak, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to resonate from everywhere and nowhere. You sought to free me, not knowing the true bond that held me. Now you shall see the world through the eyes of the damned, she whispered menacingly. The air around them thickened, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breaths became visible, misting in the frigid air. The candles that had been blown out flickered to life on their own, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls, distorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach towards them. Dr. Lutz, regaining some semblance of control, began to chant in an ancient language, her voice steady but strained. Antoinette laughed, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. With a wave of her hand, the book from which Dr. Lutz was reading flew across the room, its pages fluttering wildly before it slammed shut, silencing the protective incantations. Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine as he realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. He glanced towards the others, Marie, a young researcher, and Jonathan, a seasoned paranormal investigator. Both looked back at him with wide, fearful eyes. They were trapped in this haunted tableau, with no clear way out. Antoinette began to pace slowly around them, her movements unnaturally graceful. As she moved, the mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its edges creeping with a shadowy mist that slowly filled the room, reducing their visibility to mere feet in front of them. Who are you really? Tom managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. I am the keeper of shadows, the mistress of lies, bound by blood and darkness, Antoinette replied, her voice resonating with a chilling authority. This mirror, my prison, has grown hungry over the centuries, fed only by the occasional stray soul. But now it thirsts for more. The mirror suddenly erupted in a blaze of spectral light, illuminating the room with an otherworldly glow. Faces appeared in the reflective surface, twisted in expressions of horror and despair. These were the souls of those who had come before them, ensnared by the mirror's curse, forever trapped within its depths. Marie, whose curiosity had always edged out her caution, stepped closer to the mirror, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. What does it want? She asked, her voice trembling. It wants what all cursed beings desire, freedom from its eternal torment. But its freedom comes at a cost, Antoinette said as she turned her gaze towards Marie, a sinister grin spreading across her face. Suddenly, Marie was lifted off the ground, her body suspended in the air by an unseen force. She screamed, thrashing wildly as she was pulled towards the mirror. Tom and Jonathan lunged forward, trying to grab her, but their hands passed through her body as if she were made of smoke. Dr. Lutz shouted more incantations, her voice desperate and powerful. The air crackled with energy, and Marie's body stopped its horrific progression towards the mirror. Slowly, she was lowered back to the ground, gasping for breath. As the boundary between their world and that of the cursed mirror blurred, the room filled with an oppressive darkness that seemed to breathe and pulse with a life of its own. The air was thick, making each breath they took feel like inhaling a heavy, cold mist. The darkness wasn't just around them, it felt as though it penetrated into their very souls, clawing at their fears and darkest secrets. Antoinette's form became more defined in the darkness, her figure occasionally merging with the shadows that seemed to serve her. Her eyes, glowing a faint red, watched them with an intensity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Tom, trying to muster his courage, spoke through chattering teeth. What do you want from us? Antoinette's smile widened, her teeth impossibly white in the shadowy room. It's not what I want from you, she replied, her voice echoing as if from a great distance yet intimately close. It's what the mirror wants. It hungers for souls, for life, for the energy that you, living beings, exude so freely. Dr. Lutz stepped forward, her eyes narrowed in determination. We will not let you use us as fodder for this cursed object. We will break this cycle and free those trapped, including you, Antoinette. Antoinette laughed, the sound chilling them to the bone. Your bravery is commendable but misguided. You cannot free what does not wish to be freed. I have embraced my role, my power. But if you insist on continuing this foolish quest, I will indulge you, for a price. Marie, still shaken from her earlier ordeal, whispered to Jonathan, there has to be a way to reverse this. There has to be. Jonathan nodded, his eyes scanning the room for any item that might serve as a tool or weapon. The original ritual, it's our best bet. We need to find out how she was bound to the mirror and replicate that process, but in reverse. Dr. Lutz agreed, her voice urgent. We need to go to my office. I have books, old manuscripts that aren't just folklore. They contain real spells, real incantations that could help us. They decided to make a break for it. Tom suddenly rushed to the window, attempting to open it, but the window seemed sealed, unyielding to his efforts. The darkness laughed, a low, menacing sound that filled the room. You cannot leave so easily, Antoinette's voice came from all around them. You are part of the game now. With a collective determination, they turned back to face the mirror. Antoinette's figure stood, her arms spread wide, as if embracing the darkness that swirled around her. Dr. Lutz began chanting loudly, her voice clear and powerful, the ancient words slicing through the oppressive atmosphere. As she chanted, the mirror's surface began to ripple again, waves of dark energy emanating from it. The figures trapped within the mirror began to move, their faces contorted in anguish, reaching out towards the living. Help us, they whispered, their voices a cacophony of despair and longing. Tom felt a pull towards the mirror, an almost magnetic draw. Fighting every instinct that screamed for him to run, he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch the cold, smooth surface. As his fingers brushed against the mirror, a shock of icy cold shot through him, and he saw visions, flashes of lives long past, each one ended in tragedy and darkness. The room shook as if the house itself protested their actions, the floorboards groaning under an unseen weight. Books and objects began to levitate, swirling around them in a vortex of supernatural force. Marie, seizing a levitating book, flipped it open to a marked page. This is it, she shouted over the chaos. The binding ritual. Jonathan grabbed the book, reading quickly. We need a circle, salt, and iron. We can reinforce the mirror's binding, trap her again. Rushing against time and the increasing hostility of their surroundings, they scrambled to gather the materials. Salt from the kitchen, iron filings from Jonathan's toolbox, and their own willpower formed a makeshift circle around the mirror. As they completed the circle, the atmosphere shifted, the air crackling with electricity. Antoinette's screams filled the room, a sound so agonizing and filled with rage that it was almost palpable. No? You cannot do this to me again, she howled, her form flickering between the shadows and her human-like appearance. Ignoring the terror that gripped his heart, Tom continued the ritual, reciting the words that Jonathan pointed out from the book. With each word, the mirror pulsed, the shadows darkened, and the screaming intensified. But they didn't notice the shadows creeping along the edges of the room, forming into shapes more sinister than before. These were not merely extensions of Antoinette's will but sentient entities of their own, born from centuries of darkness harbored within the mirror's depths. As Tom recited the incantations, the figures began to move, their movements slow and deliberate, converging towards the circle where the group stood, desperate to complete the ritual. Outside the circle, the shadows formed into tall, gaunt figures with elongated limbs that stretched unnaturally. Their faces were void of features, save for deep, empty eye sockets that seemed to absorb the light around them. The temperature dropped further, a cold so severe it seared their lungs with each breath. Marie clutched the book tightly to her chest, her voice quivering as she assisted Tom with the incantations. Dr. Lutz, her hands trembling, scattered salt in a continuous line, reinforcing the protective barrier as Jonathan hammered iron nails into the ground at 4 points around the mirror, each strike ringing out like a gunshot in the eerie silence that followed each scream from Antoinette. You fools! Antoinette's voice was a tempest, swirling around them, her form flickering between the spectral and the human. You think you can bind me again? I am beyond your petty magics now. I am power untold. Her laughter was cut short as the circle of salt and iron began to glow, a faint light at first, that grew steadily brighter. The mirror itself vibrated, the surface rippling like water disturbed by a fierce wind. Within the glass, the trapped souls began to scream louder, their faces distorting in agony and fear. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light, emanating from the mirror. The figures in the shadows recoiled, their forms dissipating as if burned by the light. Antoinette's form stabilized, her eyes widening in fear as she realized what was happening. No, not again, she cried, her voice echoing off the walls. The light grew, encompassing the whole room, enveloping everything in its pure, harsh brilliance. The figures within the mirror pushed forward, their hands pressing against the glass as if trying to escape the confines of their prison. Tom continued the chant, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. The book in Marie's hands glowed, the pages fluttering rapidly as if caught in a storm. Dr. Lush and Jonathan continued their work, reinforcing the protective circle, their faces set in grim determination. As the ritual neared its climax, the air in the room tensed, charged with energy that could be felt physically pressing against their skins. The mirror's glow intensified, the screams grew louder, and the shadows deepened, creating a stark contrast with the light. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light snapped back into the mirror, like a flame being sucked into a vacuum. The room plunged into darkness, the silence so profound it rang in their ears. They stood there, panting, waiting for their eyes to adjust to the darkness. The temperature began to rise, the oppressive cold receding as if it had never been. Slowly, light returned, the natural moonlight filtering in through the windows, casting long, somber shadows across the room. The mirror stood still, its surface calm and reflective once again. But it was different now, it no longer pulsed with dark energy. Instead, it seemed ordinary, just a piece of antique glass framed by tarnished gold. But the relief was short-lived. As they approached the mirror, wary but hopeful, they noticed something had changed. The faces within the mirror, those tormented souls they had seen before, were gone. In their place was a single figure, standing far back in the depths of the mirror's reflection. It was Antoinette, her face serene, eyes closed as if at peace. But behind her, the shadows gathered, darker and more substantial than before. They moved, not with the random, chaotic motion of shadows cast by light and object, but with purpose and intelligence. They watched, and they waited. The group exchanged looks, a mix of relief and new, dawning horror. They had not ended the curse. They had changed it, evolved it. Whatever they had done, the darkness within the mirror had adapted, grown stronger, and more cunning. We need to leave, Dr. Lutz said, her voice low, urgent. Now. They gathered their things quickly, casting wary glances at the mirror as they moved. As they reached the door, Tom looked back. The shadows seemed to press against the glass, as if testing its strength, looking for a way out. They left the house, the door closing with a resolute thud behind them. The night air was cool, the stars bright above them, a stark contrast to the darkness they had left inside. But as they walked away, the weight of what remained unresolved hung heavy, and as they hurried away from the house, the night seemed to close in around them. The moon, once a faint source of light, now seemed unnaturally bright, casting long, sinister shadows that danced on the edges of their vision. The trees along the path whispered among themselves, leaves rustling in a wind that felt like the soft murmurs of the damned. The very air was charged with a palpable tension, as if the world itself held its breath. Dr. Lutz kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes searching the darkness for any sign that the shadows had followed them from the house. Tom felt a chill each time the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that sounded suspiciously like Antoinette's mocking laughter. "We need to figure out what went wrong," Marie said, her voice barely above a whisper as if afraid of being overheard. "The ritual should have bound her again, not whatever that was." Jonathan, his brows furrowed in concentration, nodded. "It's like we didn't trap her in the mirror, we trapped her with the mirror. We made it a part of her domain, gave her control over it." "That can't be it," Tom argued, his mind racing through every detail of the ritual. "We followed the instructions perfectly. Something else must have influenced the outcome. Something we're not seeing." Dr. Lutz stopped in her tracks, causing the others to halt as well. "The mirror itself," she said slowly, a new realization dawning in her eyes. "It's not just a prison or a conduit, it's a source of power. It's been gathering energy, feeding off every interaction with the living world. When we performed the ritual, we didn't just reinforce the prison, we supercharged it." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. They had inadvertently strengthened the very curse they sought to defeat, intertwining Antoinette's essence with the mirror's dark energy. "We need to destroy it," Marie said, her voice resolute. "It's the only way to ensure she doesn't use it to escape into our world." They turned back towards the house, each step heavier than the last, knowing what they had to do. Their house loomed in the distance, its silhouette a dark blot against the night sky. As they approached, a cold wind swept through, carrying with it a foul stench of decay. Inside, the mirror stood as they had left it, still and silent. But as they drew closer, the air around it vibrated with an unseen force. The shadows within the room seemed to recoil from the mirror, as if even they feared what it had become. Tom, with a hammer in hand, stepped forward. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing loudly in the silent room. He raised the hammer, hesitating for just a moment as he met the gaze of Antoinette's serene image in the glass. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure whom he was apologizing to, the woman trapped in the mirror, or himself for what he was about to do. With all his might, he swung the hammer. The impact sent a shockwave through the room. Cracks appeared on the mirror's surface, spiderwebbing outwards with a sound like ice breaking. The air screamed, a sound so piercing it bordered on physical pain. The mirror's surface blackened, the cracks glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. Then, with a sound like the world itself tearing apart, the mirror shattered. Pieces of glass rained down, reflecting the last of the cursed light before going dark. They stood in silence, watching as the shadows in the room dissipated, melting away like smoke in the wind. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the house lifted, leaving behind only the normal, quiet darkness of an uninhabited building. As they left the house for the final time, the early rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting the world in a new light. They felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, the weight of their actions heavy on their shoulders. They had stopped a dark force, but at what cost? And was it truly over, or had they only paused the inevitable? Tom looked back once more, the ruins of the mirror catching the first light of day, sparkling briefly before fading into the dull grey of the dawn. They walked away, the echo of their steps a solemn cadence in the quiet morning. As they disappeared into the morning mist, the scene faded to black, leaving the questions unanswered, the future uncertain. As the first light of dawn washed over Elmdale, Tom, Dr. Lutz, Marie, and Jonathan walked away from the Victorian house, the remains of the shattered mirror left behind. Their shadows stretched long and thin in the early morning light, blending with the mist that rose off the ground, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow the night's horrors. The town was waking up, the early risers unaware of the battle that had been fought on the outskirts of their sleepy community. The group walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the night's events and the consequences of their actions. As they approached the center of town, the first signs of life greeted them, lights flickering on in houses, the distant sound of a door slamming, the faint buzz of morning routines beginning. The normalcy of it all seemed surreal to them now, tainted by the knowledge of what lurks just beneath the surface of everyday life. They stopped at the local diner, a place that had always served as a hub for the town's gossip and camaraderie. The warm light and the smell of coffee and bacon were a stark contrast to the cold and shadows of the house they had left behind. They settled into a booth, and for the first time since the night began, they allowed themselves to relax, just a bit. As they sipped their coffee, Tom looked at his companions. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. His voice was low, wary, as if he was afraid to hear the answer. Dr. Lutz, looking older and more tired than he had ever seen her, sighed deeply. "I think we did what we could. The mirror is destroyed, and with it, the portal that allowed Antoinette and the shadows such direct access to our world. But the energy that powered it, the darkness, can we ever truly be rid of it?" Marie pondered aloud, staring into her coffee cup as if it held the answers. Jonathan, always the pragmatist, added, "We may have stopped this threat, but there will always be others. Dark forces don't cease to exist, they merely find a new form, a new way in. We've won this battle, but the war against the darkness, it's far from over." Their words hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the fragile veil that separates the known from the unknown, the light from the darkness. They finished their breakfast in silence, each processing the night's terrors and triumphs in their own way. As they stepped out of the diner, the sun had fully risen, casting golden hues across the town. The light seemed to chase away the last remnants of the night's darkness, offering a semblance of peace and a promise of a new day. But as they walked back towards their homes, a faint whisper of wind brushed past them, sending a chill down their spines. It was a subtle reminder that the darkness was never truly gone, merely pushed back into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. In the days that followed, life in Elmdale returned to its usual pace. The mirror and its dark legacy became yet another ghost story in the town's colourful history, whispered about in the corners of the diner and around campfires. Tom continued his studies, but he was changed, more introspective, and acutely aware of the thin lines that separate worlds. Dr. Lutz went back to her research, more determined than ever to understand and combat the forces that they had faced. Marie and Jonathan found solace in each other, their shared experiences forging a bond that was both comforting and unbreakable. As the season changed and the leaves began to fall, painting the town in shades of orange and red, a sense of normalcy settled over Elmdale. But in the quiet moments, when the wind howled just right, the residents could hear a whisper, a laugh, carried on the breeze, a haunting reminder of the night when the barrier between worlds was torn open. And deep in the woods, where the shadows grow long and the light struggles to penetrate, the fragments of the broken mirror lay scattered, occasionally catching the light, a silent testament to the thin veil between darkness and light, and the eternal watchfulness required to maintain the balance. The story of the darkest pit of the internet ended, but the door it opened, into the vast, uncharted territories of the human psyche and the mysteries of the beyond, remained ajar, an invitation to those brave or foolhardy enough to explore the shadows that linger just out of sight.